Be strong, sweetie. It will all be over before you know it, Mrs. Turner said with a smile. That's right. You'll be out like a light in a few seconds. Then you'll wake up like nothing happened, Mr. Turner added with a confident tone. Yeah, I guess, Timmy replied, sounding a little nervous. Cosmo and Wanda had hidden underneath Timmy's bed with their housefly forms to avoid being seen. They had planned to hide up on the corner of the ceiling to watch over Timmy as he went through his surgery. Once the hospital bed was in his room, the doctors and nurses lifted Timmy onto the surgery table and then began to prepare him for the surgery. Cosmo and Wanda flew out from under the beds just as one of the nurses wheeled it back out of the surgery room. Then they landed on a high shelf in the corner of the room where they wouldn't be spotted by the surgeons. You sure Timmy's gonna be alright? Cosmo asked worriedly as he watched the doctors and nurses inserting IV needles into Timmy's arms. I'm sure the surgeons know what they're doing. He'll be done with it before you know it, Wanda replied assuredly. Cosmo then watched as the doctors hooked up the heart monitor to Timmy's chest. To the monitor that was his vitals and his heart rate, then hooked him up to a bunch of different machines as well. Cosmo noticed that one of the doctors telling Timmy not to worry about anything and that he'd be asleep throughout the surgery. Once he took several long breaths of the anesthesia gas, this convinced Timmy that things will be okay and visibly relaxed himself on the surgery table. Alright, Timmy, just lay there and relax. Once we're ready, I'll place the breathing mask over your mouth and you'll just take several deep breaths. Once you do that, you'll be asleep before you know it. Then you'll wake up in the recovery room, feeling better than ever, the head surgeon instructed. Timmy simply nodded as several other surgeons wheeled the cart with various surgical instruments along them, with various other equipment, and parked next to the surgical table. Shortly after everything was set up, he heard the surgeon switched out the knockout gas machine and placed the breathing mask over Timmy's mouth and nose. Okay, sport, just breathe in deeply several times and you'll be snoozing away, the surgeon said. Timmy nodded and began inhaling as long and deep as he could, eager to whisk away into sleep so that he could get it all over with. As Timmy inhaled and exhaled, he could feel his eyes beginning to get heavier. As he suddenly felt very drowsy, Timmy realized that the gas was starting to take effect and began to grow more and more sleepy. As he moved his eyes around, Timmy caught a glimpse of Cosmo and Wanda watching him high upon the shelf from the corner of the hall. When the digital clock wall was hanging from the wall next to the shelf, which read 12:50 p.m. This was the last thing Timmy saw before he shut his eyes fully, letting his blackness of sleep engulf him. However, Timmy suddenly opened his eyes slowly, feeling the drowsiness wearing off as quickly as it came. He was slightly confused at first, but then he remembered his doctor and parents telling him that he'd be falling asleep once the doctors hit him with the knockout gas. Timmy would wake up like nothing had happened. At first, Timmy thought that was the case, but quickly realized that something wasn't right. Timmy noticed that moving his eyes and that he was still in the surgery room. When his eyes found the digital clock on the wall, he felt his heart skip a beat when he saw it and it now read 12:55 p.m. 5 minutes? I've been only asleep for 5 minutes? Timmy thought in shock. Then he noticed a small curtain-like device being pulled up right between his head and chest and the center of his neck, blocking his view ahead. His breathing mask had been removed from Timmy's face, as he was very clearly had heard one of the surgeons say, "Alright, it looks like he's fully sedated. We can begin now." Upon hearing that, Timmy quickly tried opening his mouth to alert the surgeons that he wasn't asleep any longer, but suddenly realized that he couldn't. His mouth wouldn't move. In fact, Timmy found out that he couldn't move any part of his body at all. His body was completely frozen, locked in place, and he couldn't move or even speak. But Timmy could then see and hear his surroundings, the only parts of his body, and he could still move freely, as were his eyeballs. But everything else was completely immobilized. No, I can't move. Why can't I move? Timmy thought in his mind, but then he quickly remembered the one detail that one of the nurses had told him earlier. Timmy had been told that once he was fully asleep, A special paralytic drug would be injected into his body, which would completely immobilize him. This was assured that Timmy's body wouldn't be able to move during the surgery and possibly cause him to injure himself. Upon realizing this, Timmy began to panic. Somehow the knockout gas had failed and he had woken up completely immobilized, unable to move or speak. Which was even worse was that the doctors didn't seem to notice Timmy had suddenly woken up. Timmy assumed that his was because of the small curtain was pulled up between his neck, which blocked his view and head and face. However, things only got much worse from there. Timmy heard the doctor say, "Ready, doctor. Let's start cleaning the abdominal area." At this point, Timmy began to panic even further, as he noticed one of the surgeons reaching for something on the surgical tray. And a curtain in front of Timmy's face was slightly transparent, so he was able to make out the outlines of the shapes of people moving around. One of the nurses held a metal instrument on the metal stick with a cotton swab on it, then lowered it on the abdominal area of Timmy's body where the appendix was located. "No, stop! I'm asleep! Stop, please!" Timmy yelled in his mind, but it was no use. He then couldn't even move or speak, but soon realized something else as well. As soon as the nurses began clearing the abdominal area of Timmy's body, he suddenly felt it. He could actually felt the wet cotton rubbing against his stomach and struck Timmy with instant realization that filled him with pure dread and horror. I felt that. If I felt it, then that means... Timmy couldn't even want to finish that thought, upon realizing what this meant. If he was going to feel the wet cotton on his skin, then this also means he'll be able to feel the pain, and that can only mean one thing. If the doctors began to operate on him now, he'd feel everything what's going on, and even though that thought filled Timmy with the level of terror beyond anything else. No, 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 help me! Someone help me! Timmy yelled in his mind. He was now in a full panic mode at this point, desperately trying as hard as he could to fight off the drug's effects in order to move. But it was hopeless. The paralytic drugs had been pumped into his system, and they were too powerful, and they prevented him from doing anything at all. Timmy moved his eyes around wildly, hoping someone would see him awake and then put him back to sleep so that he could avoid the horror that he was about to go through. No one noticed him at all, though. Even Cosmo and Wanda weren't yet aware that Timmy had woken up. They were in the area on the shelf positioned on the other side of the curtain over Timmy's neck, so they couldn't really see that his eyes were open. His heart monitor stated beeping a bit quicker than usual, since Timmy was now terrified at what was about to happen. And for that moment, he thought he might be able to get the surgeon's attention. Timmy saw one of the doctors glance over at the heart monitor, then down at Timmy, who turned back to whatever he was doing. "The kid's heart rate increased a bit," Timmy heard him say. "It's probably due to the medication. It's been known to happen sometimes," another doctor replied. Timmy felt his heart sink. This was his possible chance of being separated from fate. Worse than death was now gone, and he had been faced with the most horrible experience he had ever had in his whole life. This was confirmed that he heard one of the nurses say, "All right, I'll grab that scalpel and make the incision here." Timmy's eyes widened in horror when he saw that the doctors grabbed the scalpel from the surgical tray and began lowering it towards the abdominal area. He knew immediately what was coming and began to panicking. Worse than he ever did. "No, stop, please, no, I'm still awake. Please, don't, I beg you, please!" Timmy screamed in his head, harder than ever to move. It was no use. The paralytic drugs running through his body ensured that he wouldn't move an inch. Just as Timmy was about to glance over at Cosmo and Wanda, he felt it. Within an instant, Timmy felt the horrible, agonizing pain suddenly rush through him, like that moment the scalpel made contact with the skin and flesh. Timmy screamed in agony while his mind, as he felt the surgeon slicing open his body with the scalpel. It was just like the pain he's never felt before in his entire life. Timmy remembered that all the times that had received Eve with the serious injuries in the past, and they had hurt like hell. But this was nothing compared to the extreme amount of agony and pain he felt right at that moment. A flood of tears began to run down Timmy's face as he felt a sharp surgical blade slicing open his body and hurts beyond anything imaginable. No, it hurts! Stop, 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 stop! It hurts! Someone help! Stop them! Mom, Dad, Cosmo, Wanda, anyone help! It hurts! It hurts! Ah! Timmy screamed in his head, begging for the doctors to stop, wishing them to stop. But they didn't. The pain only got worse from there. But the scalpel was the least of his worries, because what he heard the doctor say next made Timmy almost lose his mind. The muscles are a bit tough to go under the skin. We're gonna need something stronger to open it up, the surgeon said with the scalpel informed. Nurse passed the buzzsaw. We can only use that to increase the size of incision, another doctor replied. Timmy felt his blood turn to ice when he saw the nurse hand the surgeon an air-powered surgical buzzsaw. It resembled a dentist drill. It was only much bigger, and the circular saw on the blade at the end of it was the size of a cup coaster. Timmy was already in more pain than he ever had been in his life, but he knew that if that buzzsaw cut right into him, it would just be far worse than the scalpel. The surgeon turned switch on the buzzsaw. It was loud and it sounded like a dentist drill, a chainsaw mixed together even. Timmy tried so hard to get anyone's attention to end this horrible nightmare, but no one had noticed him. He couldn't understand why the machines weren't alerting anyone while that he was still awake, but it no longer mattered. Timmy was paralyzed, and all he could do nothing but watch. The surgeon slowly lowered the buzzsaw towards the already slightly open incision at the bottom of the stomach. As soon as the spinning blade made contact with the incision, Timmy had almost lost but his insanity. Up to this point, he had already experienced the agonizing pain about being sliced open with the scalpel, but the second that this buzzsaw began sawing open, Timmy felt from it that he couldn't even put into words. If he had been able to, he would have let out a blood-curdling scream, loud enough to make it through the whole city to hear. The buzzsaw let out a horrible flesh-grinding sound as it slowly opened Timmy's abdominal area, causing a small amount of blood to hit the curtain. Much to Timmy's already traumatic horror, he screamed in his mind. The scream louder and louder than he ever had in his life. At this point, the pain was beyond intense. All Timmy wished for was death, but he couldn't come. He was in hell, and he was granted no mercy. However, this moment of pure hell, Timmy didn't even notice that someone standing over near the window, leaning outside of the surgery room. For a brief second, Timmy saw that it was none other than Vicky. She had the most evil, sadistic grin on her face that he's ever seen in his life. Upon seeing Vicky grinning at Timmy at his moments of pure hell, it all made sense. He understood that very reason as to why he had woken up and was now in this position. It was all because it had been all her fault. Timmy didn't know how Vicky did it, but he knew he had somehow been in that way. She had done something to make the knockout gas fail, and in that moment of pure agony and torture, Timmy remembered Vicky saying to him earlier that she had been at the hospital for one reason, and that was to get back at him for letting her get stuck in that tar pit months ago. Timmy had been crying blood at this point, and his eyes began laughing in pure insanity upon realizing that Vicky was behind us. I should have known it was you. It was always you. It was always you. Timmy cackled in his mind with nothing more than pure insanity. His sanity was all but completely broken at this point. All he could do was continue to scream in agony and the pain in his mind as Vicky continued to watch the show unfold outside of the surgery room, unaware that Timmy was feeling everything going on. Being the idiot Vicky was, she had assumed that the paralytic drugs numbed the pain from the surgery. But oh, how wrong she was. Vicky noticed that Timmy's eyes were moving around wildly, so she only assumed this was because he was scared out of his wits. Vicky had no idea that Timmy was very much in pain, and it had been broken in his mind, yes. But however, Vicky was much too busy watching Timmy glee that she didn't even notice Cosmo had suddenly taken notice of her from inside the surgery room. "Wanda, Vicky's outside of the surgery room," Cosmo pointed out. Wanda looked over the window of the surgery room and saw that Vicky grinning evilly down at Timmy and it confused her. That's odd. Why is Vicky acting like that? Wanda asked, puzzled. I don't know, but she appears to be looking down at his face. I can't see it from here, Cosmo replied, then spread his wings. I'll go check to see what she's looking at. Cosmo flew high above the room, eventually making it out to the other side of the curtain, and then saw what made him gasp in horror. Timmy's eyes were wide open, moving around wildly, and there were bloody tears flowing from the sides of his face. Upon realizing this, Cosmo realized in horror that Timmy was wide awake and was clearly in unimaginable pain. Oh my god! Cosmo gasped in horror, then zipped back over towards Wanda. Cosmo, what is it? Wanda asked worriedly. It's Timmy! He's awake! Wanda, he must have woken up during this, right when the doctors were, Cosmo paused when he saw the surgeons now fully opening Timmy's abdominal area to reveal his insides. Wanda's face turned pale with horror upon realizing what this meant. Then she glanced over the surgery window and saw Vicky still watching everything with that evil grin on her face. As soon as Wanda saw this, she felt her blood boil with rage. Wanda had no doubt in her mind that Vicky was somehow behind this, and it made her feel tempted just to lash out and attack Vicky. But Wanda knew deep and down that this wasn't possible, since it was a violation of their rules, and fairies were not allowed to attack other humans, so that wasn't an option. She then noticed Vicky suddenly speaking to herself, then glancing over at Cosmo. Cosmo, fly out of the surgery room and transfer to a security camera. I want to catch Vicky in the act, she ordered with a serious tone. How is that going to help Timmy? I've got to help him, Wanda. Can't you tell that he's in pain? Cosmo protested. We can't do with that without revealing ourselves to the surgeons. And you know what happens if we break that rule, Wanda shot back. But if you record Vicky in the act, we'll send the footage of it straight to the security office. Timmy will be able to prove that Vicky was to blame for what happening to him. Cosmo understood that and nodded, and then he flew quickly out of the surgery room, easily fitting between the two double doors of the housefly form. Afterwards, he then flew up to the ceiling hall and transported himself into a security camera, then positioned himself to where he was directly facing Vicky. Cosmo then connected himself wirelessly to the hospital's main security recording system and began to recording Vicky as she began suddenly speaking out loud. Hope you're enjoying watching your own guts getting ripped out, you little twerp. Cry all you want, but you ain't going anywhere. At least, I was kind enough to assure you that it would only wake you up to be paralyzed and not feel anything. Vicky sneered with an evil laugh. Hearing that made Cosmo so angry that he was attempted to zoom down and retaliate against his evil teen for putting his godson through the most unimaginable torture ever in his life. But he knew that the laws of the fairy kingdom that it had to be followed, or the consequences would not be good. Cosmo then realized something upon hearing Vicky say the part about Timmy not feeling pain. She must have assumed that Timmy wasn't feeling any pain, but it was clear to him and Wanda that Timmy was most certainly feeling pain due to the bloody tears and that he was shedding. Cosmo held back the rage and just continued to record Vicky as she stood there, gloating to herself for pulling the most evil prank she had ever pulled in her life. Unaware that she was being watched and recorded the whole time, Cosmo's footage was currently being uploaded to the hospital's main security camera system, meaning that the entire hospital staff would soon know the truth of what's going on once the security team saw it. Meanwhile, in the surgery room, Wanda could only gaze down at poor Timmy, object to the horror of the surgeon sliced out the swollen appendix with a surgical buzzsaw and began stitching up the internal wound. Then he felt it all. More and more tears of blood ran down from the sides of Timmy's face, as he was forced to endure the hellish agony and pain of it all. His mind, his body, and spirit had been broken at this point, and he had all lost hope. Timmy knew that if he ever made it out of this, he would never be the same again. Wanda had also broken down into tears upon hearing all the pain and agony Timmy was going through, and at this point she couldn't take it anymore. It was clear at this point that the doctors weren't even going to notice Timmy was awake. So Wanda knew she had to find a way to turn their attention to him, somehow without letting the surgeons see her. I've got to save Timmy from this horrible nightmare without getting seen by the surgeons. If they see me, me and Cosmo will have to leave Timmy forever, and I can't let that happen. Not during a time like this, Wanda murmured softly, as she flew up to the center of the room, trying to find something, anything to get the surgeons' attention. At first she thought about pushing the medical tray on the floor, but she knew if she did that, there'd be a good chance that the surgeons would see her. Even though Wanda was in housefly form, she couldn't risk being seen. Upon hearing the whole room, her eyes suddenly fell upon the large red button was just against the wall beside Timmy's head, which read, Master Alarm. The buttons was reached all in the metal box that led up to the large speaker on the wall, along with the info panel at the button that read, Press in case of an emergency. Realizing that the alarm button was obscured by the curtain separating the view from Timmy's head, Wanda quickly flew over to it, causing Timmy to catch a glance of her flying. Once Wanda reached the master alarm, she transformed into her human form, just a size big enough to push down the button. Once Wanda saw that no one save for Timmy was looking for her, she quickly slammed the palm against the button. A red light began flashing on the ceiling, followed by a wailing sound of 95 despicable alarm system that instantly caught the attention of all the surgeons in the room, who all turned to face the alarm. Just as Wanda tranced back into a housefly, zipped right back up to the shelf to avoid being caught. What the hell? The master's alarm is going off. One of the doctors exclaimed in surprise. Did someone hit the button? I don't think so. It must have been a short circuit or something, one of the male nurses said. I'll shut it off. From on the shelf, Wanda watched as the nurse walked towards the alarm, and with a set of keys in his hands, he then suddenly glanced down at Timmy's face, had once been passed with all the curtain, ran over Timmy's neck. Wanda saw the nurse's expression, instantly turned that into terror. Upon realizing Timmy, glancing back at him with tears of blood running down from his face. Oh my God! The nurse gasped in horror, then glanced over at the other surgeons with the pale face. The kid's awake! Oh my God, he's awake! What? The head surgeon exclaimed in horror, then rushed over to the other side of the curtain and saw Timmy's eyes wide open, crying blood. Oh my freaking God! The head surgeon replied in the tone of absolute horror. Then he looked over to the other doctors and nurses. Give me one of the anesthesia gas over here now. Nurse, shut that damn alarm off. The two doctors wheeled out the knocked out gas cart over to Timmy, as the nurse inserted the key in the slot above the master alarm button to turn it off and turn it to left. The alarm went silent, along with the red light shutting off. The head surgeon then quickly placed the breathing mask over Timmy's face and switched on the gas. Although Timmy couldn't move, his lungs were still breathing on their own, so Wanda was pretty sure Timmy would fall asleep and be free from all the pain and agony. However, the doctor held the mask over Timmy's nose and mouth, and he could feel something was wrong when Timmy didn't seem to be falling asleep. His eyes were still wide open, even after 2 minutes of keeping the mask over his face. Something's wrong. He's not falling asleep, the head surgeon replied, then glanced over at the machine, administering the gas. Hey, what's that thing? It's gonna fill line dial? One of the other male nurses looked down at the dial, pointed to the full line, and saw that the tiny super magnetic Vicky had attached to it was still attached to the machine, and he reached it out and pulled it off. At the moment later, the needle fell and the dial instantly dropped to the E, meaning that the knockout gas tanks were empty. What the hell? Doctor, we've got a serious problem here, the nurse reported in a serious tone. What's going on? Was that thing you just pulled off the dial? The head surgeon demanded. I think it was a magnet, and it was holding the dial needle to full, but the tanks were actually empty the whole time, the nurse reported. The head surgeon glanced down briefly at the dial of the knocked out gas and saw that the machine was indeed empty, and then he glanced over at the machine and that it would sound alert if the patient suddenly awoke during surgery. Then he got another shock. The machine status showed that Timmy was asleep, when he in fact wasn't asleep at all. His heart monitor didn't appear to be working right, as it showed Timmy's vitals being normal, when they should have shown pretty much spiraling out of control due to the immediate pain that he was feeling. His eyes widened in horror when he realized of how Timmy had woken up, and they weren't alerted to him being awake. Why wasn't he not fallen back asleep?